Grant Thornton stood at the small kitchen window of his apartment in downtown Chicago, watching the first signs of dawn creep over the horizon. It was a moment he always cherished. The city, still quiet and undisturbed by the clamor of the day ahead, seemed like a peaceful contrast to his life, a life that, in many ways, had been molded by routine and simplicity. He had come a long way from the small town in Iowa where he grew up. His childhood had been full of hard work, the kind of honest physical labor that left you satisfied at the end of the day, even if you had sweat through every part of your body. On that farm, life had a rhythm. It was predictable. It was safe. But somewhere along the way, Grant had felt the pull of something more. He wanted more than the quiet fields and the familiar faces. He wanted to experience the world, to challenge himself in ways that only big cities could offer. That's why he had packed up and moved to Chicago, leaving the quiet rhythms of the farm behind. He entered the fast-paced world of finance, determined to prove that his work ethic, shaped by years of tilling the land, could translate into the concrete jungle. He had become a tax consultant, nothing glamorous, but it provided the steady rhythm he had always known, and for the most part, it felt comfortable. Yet, the comfort was bittersweet. The city that promised so much also carried the weight of isolation. He had a job, an apartment, and a routine. But at night, when the skyscrapers cast long shadows over the streets and the honking cars filled the air, Grant couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. There was no one to share his meals with, no one to walk beside him in the crowd. It was a life full of potential but still hollow in its core. And then there was Veronica Lambert. She had entered his life like a burst of color in a monochrome world. Their first meeting had been so ordinary it was almost laughable, just a casual dinner at a mutual friend's apartment. But from the moment they spoke, there was something magnetic about her. Veronica was everything Grant wasn't. Polished, confident, full of stories that seemed to radiate sophistication. She worked in the world of corporate finance, where the stakes were high and the rewards even higher. Her smile was effortless, her elegance almost otherworldly. Grant had always thought of himself as a simple man, someone who had learned the value of hard work, of being steady and reliable. But with Veronica, he felt like he had stumbled into a world he had only ever dreamed about. The way she carried herself made him want to rise to her level, to become something more than the man he had been before. And for the first time in years, he felt a spark of something resembling hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the chance to truly change his life. The weeks that followed were a blur of dinners, late-night conversations, and long walks through the city where Grant found himself both lost and found at the same time. Veronica was not just beautiful. She was engaging, intelligent, and so very different from anyone he had ever known. Her laughter echoed in his mind long after their conversations ended, and the warmth of her hand in his felt like a promise that he could hold on to. But even with all the excitement, Grant remained guarded. He knew what it was like to have things taken from you. He had seen his family struggle with loss, with the kind of heartbreak that could shatter your world in a single instant. He couldn't afford to open himself up completely, not yet. He needed to know that this was real, that Veronica saw him for who he was, and not just for the man he could become in her world. The truth was, Grant had never let anyone get too close. His past, his family, his simple, hard-working life, those were the parts of him that stayed hidden. He wasn't sure if Veronica could ever understand them, or if she would even want to. And so, he kept those parts of himself tucked away, carefully hidden, hoping that maybe one day he wouldn't have to keep them in the shadows anymore. Yet, despite his caution, there was something about Veronica that made him believe he could take the leap. She was different. She seemed to see him, not just the man who worked in a stuffy office, but the one who had grown up with his hands in the soil, the one who carried the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. One evening, as they sat on a quiet bench overlooking the river, Grant felt a sense of calm wash over him. The world around them seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them. Veronica had her head tilted back, staring up at the stars, her eyes reflecting the faint light of the city. For a moment, Grant didn't feel like he was just a small-town boy trying to make it in a big city. He felt like he belonged, like he was part of something that mattered. "You know, Grant," Veronica said softly, her voice barely audible over the rush of the river below, "I never thought I'd meet someone like you here." Grant turned to her, surprised by the earnestness in her voice. "What do you mean?" She smiled, a small, knowing smile that made his heart skip a beat. "Someone who's not afraid to be real, who doesn't try to be something he's not. I think that's rare." His chest tightened at her words. She was right. He had spent so long trying to be someone else, someone worthy of her, that he had almost forgotten who he was. But in this moment, sitting beside her, everything felt clear. Maybe, just maybe, he didn't need to hide the parts of himself that seemed so insignificant. Maybe she could love him for who he truly was. And with that thought, Grant made a decision. He was ready to take the leap. As the weeks passed, Grant found himself wrapped up in a whirlwind that he never saw coming. Each day with Veronica was like unearthing something new, something he hadn't known he was missing. They spent evenings wandering through the city, finding comfort in quiet moments and shared glances. Every laugh, every touch seemed to pull him deeper into a world he had only observed from a distance, one where success and ambition were the norms, and where love didn't feel so impossible. It was strange how quickly everything seemed to fall into place. Veronica wasn't just beautiful. She was the type of woman who made him feel alive. Her presence was like a light that he had never truly known he was waiting for. She had this effortless elegance about her, a way of carrying herself that made Grant want to be more than he had been. She made him feel like his past didn't define him, like he could step into the future without the weight of his small-town roots holding him back. And yet, the more he felt that pull, the more the fear crept in. Grant had always kept a part of himself hidden, protected. It was easier that way, safer, less vulnerable. He had built his life on the simple things, never reaching for anything more than what he could touch with his own two hands. But Veronica was different. She didn't just meet his eyes, she seemed to see all the parts of him he had tried to bury. And that terrified him. He wasn't ready to open up. He wasn't ready to let go of the man he had spent years becoming, the man who built his world on routine, on quiet stability. And yet, every time she smiled at him, every time she reached out to touch his arm or lean into him during one of their conversations, he found it harder to keep up the walls. Sitting across from her at dinner one night, Grant felt a wave of emotion flood over him, an overwhelming mix of gratitude and fear. Veronica was talking about a new project at work, her words full of passion and drive, but all Grant could focus on was how beautifully her lips moved when she spoke. It wasn't just her beauty that captivated him. It was the way she made everything in the world feel like it mattered. It was the way she made him feel like he mattered. But he was afraid. Afraid of the future, afraid of what it meant to love someone like Veronica. He wasn't sure if he was ready for the kind of commitment she seemed to so easily embrace. She was everything he wasn't, polished, successful, and full of ambition. What could he offer her in return? Yet whenever he questioned the future, Veronica seemed to have an answer. Her confidence was magnetic, and it gave him the courage to imagine a life that was bigger than the small apartment he called home, bigger than the office that had once seemed so important. The more time they spent together, the more Grant began to question the limits he had placed on his own life. Maybe there was more he could become. One evening, after dinner, they walked along the lakefront, the city lights shimmering in the distance. The cool breeze swept across the water, carrying with it the scent of fresh rain. Grant could feel the tension in his chest as he tried to put his thoughts into words. He had never been one to open up, not even to his family, but there was something about Veronica that made him want to. "Veronica," he began, his voice a little shaky, "I'm not sure I'm the kind of man you think I am." She looked at him, her eyes steady, her expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, wondering if he should say it. If he should risk exposing himself, laying bare the doubts he had carried for years. I'm not like the men you're used to. I didn't grow up like you. I've spent most of my life just trying to survive, trying to make something of myself. I'm not polished, Veronica. I'm not like them." Veronica took a step closer to him, her hand brushing lightly against his arm. "You don't have to be like anyone else, Grant. You're more than enough just as you are. I see you. The man you are. The man you're becoming." Her words hit him harder than he expected. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe it, to believe that maybe he was enough, that maybe, despite all his fears and insecurities, he deserved a chance at something more. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," he said, the vulnerability in his voice surprising him. "I'm not sure if I'm ready to let go of everything I've built, everything I thought I wanted." Veronica's gaze softened. "I'm not asking you to let go of anything. I'm just asking you to be with me, honestly, completely. I don't need perfection, Grant. I just need you, all of you." In that moment, Grant felt his heart open, just a little. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid to take a step forward. Veronica wasn't asking him to change. She was asking him to embrace who he truly was. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. They stood there for a moment, the sounds of the city fading into the background, and for the first time, Grant felt a glimmer of hope, a hope that his simple, steady life could become something more, something he could share with someone who saw him, truly saw him for who he was. Grant had always prided himself on his ability to stay grounded, to see things clearly and not let his emotions take the wheel. But something about Veronica had unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. There were moments, fleeting yet significant, that made him question everything. His place in her life, his worth in a world that seemed so far removed from his own. It started small, almost imperceptible. The little things that weren't quite right but could be explained away with logic and reason. Veronica's sudden need for space, her late nights at work, when she would casually mention how much there was to do, the way her phone would buzz with an incoming message, only for her to quickly glance at it and shove it back into her bag. At first, he convinced himself it was nothing, just the pressures of her high-powered job, the sort of thing anyone in her field would understand. But as time wore on, his doubts began to grow. They had just finished dinner one evening, another quiet meal at her apartment, the kind that had become a comforting routine. Grant had felt the familiar warmth of their shared moments, but there was a subtle distance between them. Not in what they said, but in the way they said it. The conversation seemed more surface level, as if they were both skirting around something unspoken. When they moved to the couch, she excused herself to take a phone call in the other room. It was nothing unusual. Veronica had always been diligent about her work, even when she was off the clock. But this time, Grant noticed something different. The conversation was clipped, her tone more abrupt than it had been before. He could barely make out the words, but the tone sent a cold shiver down his spine. It wasn't the typical polite business call he had grown used to. When she returned, her eyes seemed a little too bright, a little too distant. Grant tried to play it off, offering her a glass of wine and forcing a smile, but the tension in the air was undeniable. They sat in silence for a long moment, and he could feel the words pressing at the back of his throat. But he didn't ask. He couldn't. He didn't want to hear the answer, whatever it was. The next day, things were worse. He tried to shake off the feeling of unease, telling himself that maybe he was overthinking things. But then he saw it. As they sat together at a cafe, she briefly glanced at her phone, her face lighting up with a smile, one that wasn't for him. It was subtle, but it hit him like a punch in the gut. She quickly covered it up, acting as though nothing had happened, but it was too late. Grant couldn't ignore the flicker of recognition in her eyes. It wasn't just a friendly message. It was something more. He didn't ask her about it. He didn't confront her right away, but the unease lingered. For days, the thought gnawed at him. Who was she texting, and why did it make him feel so small? It wasn't just the secrecy. It was the realization that maybe she didn't need him as much as he needed her. That night when they met for dinner, he tried to shake the feeling, tried to remind himself of all the good in their relationship. But every time he looked at her, he saw that smile again, the one that wasn't for him. He saw the way her gaze drifted when his hand reached for hers, as if something or someone was pulling her away. Veronica was a beautiful woman. Grant knew that. She had always carried herself with a grace that was impossible to ignore. But she wasn't just beautiful. She was captivating, magnetic in a way that left people wondering if they could ever measure up. Grant knew that too, and for the first time he was beginning to wonder if he was enough. The doubt began to creep in, so slowly at first that he almost didn't notice. The things he had once dismissed as harmless became clear signs. A comment here, a touch of impatience there. The way her smile no longer reached her eyes, the way her laughter sounded more forced. He had seen it before in the eyes of others, but he never thought he'd see it in hers. The hardest part wasn't the doubt itself. It was the fear of what it meant. If he was right, if his instincts were correct, then everything they had built together, everything he had let himself believe in, was a lie. He wasn't sure if he could bear that. But what he feared more was the thought that maybe she wasn't lying at all. Maybe she was simply falling out of love with him. Maybe he wasn't enough. Grant sat in his apartment that night staring at his phone. He couldn't make the call. Not yet. He wasn't ready to ask the question because asking meant accepting that the answer might be something he couldn't handle. As the hours stretched on, he thought about what had brought him to this point. He had worked so hard, had pushed so far to get to a place where he could finally feel like he was enough, like he could build a life that mattered. But now, faced with the possibility that Veronica wasn't the one who wanted that life with him, he felt like everything was slipping away. Was he wrong to hope for something more? Was he wrong to think that maybe he could have a future with her? Or was this just a painful reminder that nothing, no matter how much you wanted it, was ever guaranteed? He couldn't sleep, and when he closed his eyes, all he could see was her smile, the one that wasn't for him. The uncertainty in Grant's chest had only grown, gnawing at him with a relentless intensity. It was as if the doubts had taken root in his heart, spreading like vines that could no longer be ignored. Every day he tried to push them aside, telling himself that he was overthinking things, that the stress of his job and the pressures of a relationship were simply clouding his judgment. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. Veronica's behavior had changed. Not in dramatic ways, but in small, subtle shifts that tugged at his mind. She was still the same charming, confident woman he had fallen for, but there was an air of detachment now, something unspoken that hovered between them. It wasn't her distance from him that stung. It was the feeling that she was holding something back, that her laughter no longer reached her eyes. And when he reached out for her hand, she seemed to flinch, just slightly, as if she was somewhere else, even though she was physically right there beside him. Grant found himself watching her more closely, as if by sheer observation he could uncover whatever it was that she was hiding. Every time her phone buzzed, he noticed. Every time she left the room to take a call, he wondered if it was someone else. The nagging thoughts swirled in his mind, refusing to be silenced. He had told himself 1,000 times that it was nothing, that Veronica was just busy, stressed by her job, overwhelmed with everything she was juggling. But what if it wasn't that simple? It had been a few days since the last incident, the one where she had smiled at her phone in a way that made his stomach turn. He hadn't said anything to her, hadn't confronted her, but he could feel the distance growing between them. Each time she excused herself, each time she seemed lost in her own world, a new crack formed in the fragile wall of trust he had carefully built around them. Grant tried to focus on his work, but it felt impossible to concentrate. His mind kept wandering back to Veronica, the way she had been acting, the coldness that had crept into their relationship like a slow-moving storm. What was happening? Was she pulling away from him? Or was he just being paranoid? His instincts had always served him well, but now they were betraying him, leading him down a path of suspicion that he didn't want to follow. That evening, he had planned to visit her apartment after work, thinking that maybe some time together would clear the air, smooth over the rough edges that had appeared in the past week. But as he made his way there, something felt off. He hadn't heard from her all day, which wasn't unusual, but this time it felt different. She hadn't checked in as she usually did, hadn't responded to his text when he asked about dinner plans. He stood outside her door, his heart pounding in his chest, and for the first time, the doubt felt overwhelming. It was the smallest of things, a missed text, a moment of silence, but the weight of it threatened to crush him. He knocked once, twice, no answer. His hand lingered on the doorknob, the urge to push inside gnawing at him. But what would he even find if he did? What was he afraid of? Grant stepped back, the feeling of helplessness washing over him. This wasn't him. He wasn't the kind of man who gave in to jealousy or let his fears dictate his actions. But Veronica had a way of making him feel small, of making him question his worth. What if she was seeing someone else? What if everything they had was just a distraction, a placeholder in her life while she waited for something, or someone, better? His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his spiraling thoughts. It was a message from her. "Sorry, had to step out for a work call. I'll be home in 20. The relief he felt was almost immediate, but it was short-lived. It wasn't the message itself that unsettled him. It was the way it came. She had never been this curt with him before. Something was changing, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. When he finally saw her later that evening, Veronica greeted him with a distracted smile, but her eyes seemed distant, as if they weren't really seeing him. She asked him about his day, but her voice lacked the warmth it once had. There was no real connection in her words, no real interest. Grant found himself grasping at the fragments of their relationship, trying to hold on to the connection they had once shared. But it was slipping through his fingers, like water he couldn't quite catch. He tried to ask her about the missed texts, about her late nights, about everything that was gnawing at him, but the words got stuck in his throat. Instead, they ate dinner in silence, the tension between them so thick it felt suffocating. The unease in his chest only grew until he could no longer stay in the same room without feeling like he was drowning in the unspoken truth that lay between them. Later, as they sat on the couch, Grant couldn't shake the feeling that Veronica was somewhere else entirely. She leaned against him, but it didn't feel like she was truly there. Her body was close, but her mind, her heart, he had no idea. He had tried to hold on to the belief that this was just a phase, that she was stressed, that this was temporary. But as the evening wore on, the doubts continued to mount, each one more powerful than the last. What if he was losing her? What if she had already made her decision, and he was just too blind to see it? The thought was unbearable. But the more he tried to push it away, the stronger it became. Grant sat back, his thoughts spiraling out of control. The man who had once been so confident in himself, in his life, was now consumed by insecurities. And as he watched Veronica drift further and further away, he felt the terrifying truth settle in. He wasn't sure if he could ever get her back. Grant's heart raced as he stood in the dim light of Veronica's apartment, his hand gripping the edge of the kitchen counter. It had been a week since his doubts had begun to solidify into something more, a certainty that there was something wrong, something he couldn't ignore anymore. He had tried to push it all aside, convincing himself that he was just being paranoid, that the stress of work and life was clouding his judgment. But tonight, something had shifted. His instincts screamed at him that he was on the verge of uncovering the truth. And now, here he was, staring at the phone on the kitchen counter that had been left unlocked, buzzing with an incoming message. The message had caught his attention, the screen flashing with a name he didn't recognize. He hesitated for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had always told himself that trust was the foundation of any relationship. He had never been the type of man to invade someone's privacy. But tonight, the boundaries that he had once respected seemed irrelevant. His own sense of self-preservation had taken over, and a cold, gnawing need to know the truth was consuming him. With shaking hands, he picked up the phone and unlocked it, the message revealing itself in an instant. "Javier, can't wait to see you tonight. I'll be at the usual place. Tex." Grant's breath caught in his throat. The name, Javier, was unfamiliar, but the implications were undeniable. There was no mistaking the intimacy of the message, the kind of language that was reserved for something much deeper than casual friendship. A wave of nausea hit him, the realization crashing over him like a tidal wave. The world around him seemed to slow down, the apartment feeling suddenly suffocating. Javier. The name repeated in his mind over and over as he tried to make sense of it. Veronica had always been so careful with her words, so precise in her actions. This was something different. The messages, the secrecy, the late nights. He had seen the signs, but this was the confirmation he had feared. He felt a bitter taste rising in his throat, the sting of betrayal sharp and painful. For a moment he couldn't move. He stood there, staring at the phone, the weight of the discovery paralyzing him. Every part of him wanted to confront her, to demand answers right now, but something held him back. What would he even say? How could he face her after this? His mind raced, recalling all the moments that now felt like lies. The missed texts, the vague excuses, the moments when her smile had seemed distant. He had tried so hard to ignore them, to trust her, but now it all came crashing down. It was impossible to deny it any longer. Veronica, the woman he had come to love, had been lying to him. She had been hiding something, someone from him. The anger bubbled up inside him, hot and raw, but it was quickly replaced by something far worse, a deep, aching sadness. This wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about the realization that the life he had been building, the trust he had been placing in her, had been a fragile illusion. How could he have been so blind? How could he have let himself believe that she was everything he had wanted, when all along she was hiding another part of herself from him? His hands trembled as he put the phone back on the counter, his chest tightening with every breath. He needed answers, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to hear them. He wasn't sure if he could face the truth. Grant walked away from the counter, pacing around the apartment, the walls closing in on him. The silence of the room was deafening, and the weight of the secret he had just uncovered felt unbearable. His thoughts spiraled, memories of their time together flashing before his eyes, the dinners they shared, the laughter, the moments when he had believed in their future. How could all of that have been a lie? It wasn't just the affair that was eating away at him. It was the realization that he had let his guard down. He had opened himself up to her, trusted her in ways he hadn't trusted anyone in years. And now all of that felt like it had been in vain. He had allowed himself to be vulnerable, to believe in something real, and she had torn it all apart. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, Grant stood motionless in the middle of the living room, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and pain. He wanted to confront her. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, to make her explain herself, but more than anything, he wanted to understand why. Why had she done this? Why had she lied to him? Was it just a fling? Was he just another man in her life, someone to fill a void until something better came along? The sound of the door opening broke his thoughts, and before he could even react, Veronica stepped into the room, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. But the smile on her face faltered the moment she saw the expression in his eyes. "Grant, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice too sweet, too rehearsed. She was trying to act normal, as if nothing had changed, as if he hadn't just uncovered her secret. Grant's heart raced as the words hung in the air, but no response came. What could he say? What did he even want to hear from her? The silence between them stretched on, and for the first time Grant couldn't see the woman he had fallen for. He could only see the stranger she had become, and the pain of that realization hit harder than anything else. Grant's breath came in short, sharp bursts as he stared at Veronica. She had just walked in, her usual warmth and grace masked by the tension in the room. She stood by the door waiting for him to speak, her eyes searching his face for any sign of what he was thinking. But Grant's mind was a storm of emotions, swirling with confusion, anger, and betrayal. His hand trembled as it rested on the arm of the chair, but his voice was steady as he finally spoke. "I saw the message," he said quietly, his words cutting through the silence like a knife. Veronica froze, her body going rigid. A flicker of panic crossed her face before she quickly masked it with a forced smile. "What message?" she asked, her voice too calm, too rehearsed. Grant's heart clenched at the sound of her voice, the practiced ease in it, the way she deflected, avoided. He felt his chest tighten, the weight of what he was about to confront almost unbearable. But he couldn't stop now. He had come this far and he needed to know the truth, no matter how much it would hurt. "The one from Javier," he said, the name tasting bitter on his tongue. "The one where he says he'll see you tonight. The usual place, XX." Veronica's face went pale. For a moment she seemed to be holding her breath, as if the words had physically knocked the air out of her lungs. She took a step back and the mask she had so carefully constructed shattered. Her eyes darted around the room as if searching for an escape, but there was nowhere to run. She was caught. Grant's voice grew firmer, but the pain was undeniable. I don't know how much longer I could keep pretending like everything was fine, like I didn't see the signs. The late nights, the excuses, the way you were slipping away from me. I trusted you, Veronica. And this is what I get? Veronica opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She seemed to be lost for a moment, her mind racing, trying to find a way to explain, to justify what had been going on. But Grant wasn't sure he wanted to hear the explanation anymore. He didn't know if he could. Who is he? Grant demanded, his voice breaking. Tell me, Veronica. Who is he to you? Veronica's gaze shifted, her eyes flickering with something. Guilt, shame, or maybe something deeper. But then, as if by instinct, she looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Grant's heart twisted as he watched her struggle. He had never seen her like this before. The confident, poised woman he had come to admire now seemed small, vulnerable, almost defeated. For what felt like an eternity, the silence hung heavy in the air. Neither of them moved, both frozen in a moment of painful clarity. Finally, Veronica spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I never meant for you to find out this way, she began, her words trembling with uncertainty. Javier, he's someone I've known for a while, but it's not what you think, Grant. Grant felt a surge of anger. Not what I think. Veronica, don't insult me. How else am I supposed to interpret a message like that? He's been in your life for a long time, hasn't he? You've been hiding him from me. Veronica took a deep breath, her shoulders sagging as she finally met his eyes. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I never wanted to hurt you, but I was scared. Scared that you wouldn't understand, scared that I wouldn't be enough for you. Grant felt his chest tighten as her words struck him harder than he expected. He had always thought he was the one who was afraid of not being good enough, of not measuring up to the life Veronica had. But hearing her say this, hearing the raw vulnerability in her voice, made him realize just how much of their relationship had been built on fear. I was afraid that you'd leave me, she continued, her voice breaking as the truth tumbled out. That I'd lose you because I wasn't the perfect match, because I couldn't live up to everything you've built. So I pushed you away, bit by bit, until this happened. Grant's throat tightened. His anger had softened, replaced by a deep sorrow. He could hear the pain in her voice, see the tears that had started to form in her eyes. But even as his heart ached for her, he couldn't ignore the bitter sting of betrayal. You think that's an excuse? He asked, his voice hoarse. That just because you were scared, that gives you the right to lie to me? To hurt me like this? You were my partner, Veronica. I trusted you. She stepped forward, her hand reaching out toward him, but he pulled away. He wasn't ready to forgive her, not yet, not when everything felt so shattered. I never wanted to hurt you, she repeated, tears streaming down her face now. I was just so afraid of losing you. I didn't know how to tell you the truth, but now I see what I've done. I see how much I've hurt you, and I can't take it back. Grant stood still, the weight of her words settling on him like a heavy blanket. The room felt colder now, the air thick with the remnants of what they had shared, now tainted by the lies. His heart ached, not just for the betrayal, but for the future that seemed to slip further out of his reach with every passing second. I don't know if I can move past this, Veronica, he said, his voice barely audible. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. Veronica's face crumpled in grief, the weight of his words crashing down on her. She had no answer, no words that could undo the damage, and in that silence Grant knew nothing would ever be the same again. The days following the confrontation were a blur of emotions. Grant walked through life like a ghost, numb to the world around him, his mind constantly replaying the words Veronica had spoken. I never wanted to hurt you. But no matter how many times he repeated those words in his head, the truth still felt like a weight crushing him from the inside out. He spent hours sitting in the quiet of his apartment, staring out the window, wondering where everything had gone wrong. How had he missed the signs? How had he trusted her so completely, only to have the rug pulled out from under him? His mind spiraled, asking questions he didn't have answers to. The trust they had built, The love they shared now felt like it had been built on quicksand, slipping away the moment the truth was exposed. Grant knew he had to face the truth, but every part of him fought it. The truth was too painful. It wasn't just about Veronica's betrayal. It was about everything that followed. It was about the years he had spent believing in a love that wasn't real, the future he had imagined with her that now seemed so distant. The truth was too harsh, too real, and Grant wasn't sure if he could bear it. But he had to. He had no choice. It was the phone call that broke him. It wasn't from Veronica. She hadn't tried to reach out after their confrontation, leaving him to stew in his thoughts. It was from her mother, concerned, as mothers often are, that her daughter had been acting distant. The conversation started innocuously enough, a polite inquiry into how he was holding up after everything, but then, like a dam breaking, the truth came flooding in. "She's been seeing someone else for months, Grant," her mother said, her voice shaky. "Javier, I didn't want to say anything before, but I think you deserve to know. I'm so sorry. She wasn't being honest with you." Grant's breath caught in his chest, and for a moment he couldn't speak. Her words echoed in his mind like a constant drumbeat. Javier, months, lying, deceit. He had suspected, but hearing the confirmation from someone else, especially from Veronica's mother, felt like a punch to the gut. "Thank you," Grant finally said, his voice hoarse. "Thank you for telling me." But he wasn't sure who he was thanking, her mother or himself, for finally knowing the truth. The truth that had been sitting in front of him all along, but that he had refused to see. The truth that had been right there, just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. The weight of the knowledge settled into his bones, heavier than anything he had ever felt. It wasn't just the affair. It was the realization that Veronica had been playing him for a fool for so long, that he had been a pawn in her game. All the affection, the moments of closeness, the promises she had whispered to him. What had it all meant? Had it been real, or had it all been a lie? As the day wore on, Grant sank deeper into his thoughts, the floodgates opening wide as the truth seeped into every corner of his mind. He felt like a fool, like the years of his life had been wasted on someone who never cared enough to be honest with him. But more than anything, he felt lost, like he was standing at the edge of something he couldn't understand, something that would change him forever. Later that evening, Veronica called. Her voice sounded tired, almost defeated, as if she knew the moment had come, the moment when there would be no more avoiding the truth. She apologized, profusely, tearfully, but Grant could hear the emptiness in her words. It was too late for apologies now. "I'm sorry, Grant," she said, her voice cracking. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I didn't want to hurt you, but I was scared. I didn't know how to fix it." Grant closed his eyes, feeling the sting of her words like salt in an open wound. "How long, Veronica? How long were you seeing him? How long were you lying to me?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line before she answered. "Months. Her voice faltered, and for a brief moment Grant thought she might break down completely. But then she continued, her tone flat, resigned. "I didn't know how to end it, how to be honest with you." The truth was like poison in his veins. She had been living two lives, one with him and one with Javier. All the moments they had shared, all the plans they had made, it had all been a facade. He had been living in a lie, a beautiful lie that had crumbled at his feet. Grant took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I can't do this, Veronica. I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it's not." Her voice broke, pleading. "Grant, please, I love you. I don't want to lose you." But Grant was done listening to empty words. "No, you don't get to do this. Not to me. I'm done." He ended the call before she could say anything more. And as the silence filled the space where her voice had been, Grant realized something that he had been refusing to see. He had been holding on to a version of Veronica that no longer existed, a version of her that was built on lies. He had to let go. He had to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. And for the first time in days, Grant felt something other than the crushing weight of betrayal. He felt the stirrings of freedom. The truth had set him free, even if it had been the hardest thing to accept. Grant stood by the window of his apartment, the city lights casting a cold, distant glow over everything below. It had been days since the confrontation, since he had learned the full truth, but the ache in his chest hadn't subsided. He still felt the sting of betrayal, the crushing realization that everything he had believed in was a lie. Veronica's face, her tears, her apologies, they haunted him, but it wasn't her words that troubled him the most. It was the decision he had to make now, the decision that would determine the rest of his life. The question kept looping in his mind. Should he walk away? Could he walk away? He had spent years building a life, believing in love, in commitment, in trust. But now that trust had been shattered, irreparably so. And yet, in the quiet moments, when he allowed himself to think beyond the hurt, he remembered the good, the laughter they had shared, the way she made him feel like he was enough, like he could be a part of her world. Was that all just a mask? Or was there something worth saving beneath the layers of deceit? He ran a hand through his hair, the frustration mounting. It wasn't that simple. It wasn't just about whether Veronica was worthy of forgiveness. It was about him, about what he had become, what he had lost, and whether he could ever feel whole again after everything that had happened. The apartment felt suffocating now, the silence too much to bear. He needed air. He needed space to think, to breathe. But more than that, he needed to confront the decision he had been avoiding for days. When he left, he didn't know where he was going. His steps were aimless, his mind clouded, but he found himself walking toward the park, the one place in the city where he had always gone to clear his head, where he had once imagined a future with Veronica. Days full of possibilities, of love, of growth. But now that future felt distant. The park was empty, save for a few late-night joggers, the shadows of the trees stretching long in the quiet of the night. He sat on the bench, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes staring at the ground. It had been a beautiful life, he thought. But now, it felt like everything had been built on sand. How could he have been so blind? How could he have ignored the signs, the small cracks that had been appearing long before the affair had come to light? The pain was still there, raw and fresh, but the anger had faded into something quieter, more profound. What hurt the most wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the knowledge that somehow he had failed himself, that he had allowed someone else's actions to define his worth. He had given everything, but it still wasn't enough. He had to make a choice. Walk away and never look back, or stay and try to rebuild what was broken, even though he wasn't sure if it could ever be repaired. Could he forgive her? Could he forgive himself? Grant's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Veronica. She hadn't stopped trying to reach him since their last conversation. Her messages were always apologetic, filled with promises of regret, of things left unsaid, of the love they had shared. But what was the point of words now? What was the point of more apologies when they had no substance behind them? She had broken his heart, and no matter how many times she said she was sorry, it wouldn't change what had already been done. He took a deep breath, staring at the message, the words dancing before his eyes. Every part of him wanted to reply, to reach out, to make sense of it all, but he knew the truth. He couldn't keep going back to her, hoping that she would somehow change, hoping that love could fix everything. Love couldn't fix this. Grant stood up from the bench, his decision made. There was no going back now. He had to walk away. For his own peace of mind, for his own sanity, he couldn't continue living in the shadow of someone else's mistakes. And as much as it hurt, as much as the thought of leaving her tore him apart, he knew it was the only way to move forward. His heart still ached with every step he took, but with each step, he felt lighter, as if a weight was slowly lifting from his shoulders. It wasn't easy. It would never be easy. But he had spent too long ignoring his own needs, his own sense of self-worth. He had to start over, even if it meant leaving behind the person he had loved with all his heart. And so, he walked, toward an uncertain future, toward a new beginning. The road ahead was unclear, but for the first time in days, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild his life, piece by painful piece. Maybe someday he could forgive her. But today wasn't that day. Today, he was taking the first step toward healing. The days after Grant made his painful decision felt like walking through a fog. He was numb, yet everything seemed too sharp. Each moment dragged on with an unbearable heaviness, and the questions in his mind about trust, love, and the future tangled together in a way that made him feel paralyzed. He had left Veronica, but he wasn't sure he had really left the past behind. No matter how hard he tried to move forward, he felt stuck. That was until he met Amanda. It happened in the kind of way life often does, unexpectedly, almost by accident. He had wandered into a small bar late one evening, too tired to go back to his empty apartment just yet. The world outside felt cold, indifferent, and he needed a place to exist, just for a little while, without the weight of everything he had been carrying. He hadn't expected to talk to anyone, but as he sat alone at a dim corner table nursing a drink, the sound of laughter and conversation buzzed around him. Then a voice interrupted his thoughts. It was light, playful, but somehow it pierced through his fog. "You look like you could use a drink." Grant looked up to see a woman standing by his table holding 2 glasses in her hands. She had dark hair and a smile that was both genuine and mischievous. She was already handing him one of the glasses before he could even say a word. Thanks," he muttered, caught off guard. She sat down across from him without asking, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. Her eyes were kind, but there was an underlying sharpness in her gaze, as though she was accustomed to reading people, to understanding the unsaid things in the room. "I'm Amanda," she said, raising her glass to him. "And you are someone who looks like he's got 1,000 things on his mind." Grant chuckled dryly, his usual composure slipping just a little. "You could say that." She smiled and leaned in slightly, her voice softening. "Well, if you need someone to listen, you've got me for the night, but only if you're buying the next round." There was something about her, something effortless and raw, that drew him in. For the first time in days, he didn't feel like he was drowning in the storm of his own thoughts. For a few moments, he allowed himself to breathe, to simply exist in the present. Amanda wasn't trying to fix anything, wasn't asking him to share his past. She wasn't forcing him to be anything but himself. As the night went on, Grant found himself opening up, even though he hadn't meant to. He spoke of his career, of his family, of the things he had lost in the wake of his breakup. Amanda listened, her presence calming, as though her very being was a reminder that not every moment had to be weighed down by regret. At one point, she shared a small laugh, her eyes dancing with humor as she described her own work struggles in the world of criminal defense. The way she spoke about her work, about the cases, the people she helped, and even the ones she couldn't, was passionate. But there was an unspoken depth to her that Grant couldn't ignore. She had experienced loss, too. He could see it in the way she hesitated, in the moments when her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Tell me something," Amanda asked after a long silence, her tone shifting slightly. "Why does it feel like you're not really here? You're sitting in front of me, but I can tell you're somewhere else." Grant paused. He had never been good at hiding his feelings. He couldn't shake the weight of everything he had been through, the betrayal, the broken trust. It wasn't that he didn't want to be there with Amanda. It was just that every time he tried to connect, a part of him remained closed off, still guarding the pieces of his heart that Veronica had shattered. "I'm still sorting through some stuff," he admitted, his voice quiet. Amanda studied him for a long moment, her gaze unwavering. "I get it. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. But just so you know, I'm not asking you to fix anything. I'm just here. And sometimes that's enough." Grant met her eyes, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt seen, not judged, not pitied, but simply understood. It wasn't an offer of some grand solution, but rather an invitation to exist without the weight of everything else for a while. "Thanks," he whispered, the words more meaningful than he had expected them to be. They continued to talk for a while longer, the night stretching out in a slow, comfortable rhythm. When the time came to leave, Amanda gave him a small, knowing smile. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she said, her voice soft but firm. Grant wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't sure what he was looking for either. But as they parted ways, there was something in Amanda's presence that lingered, like the possibility of something better just around the corner. As he walked home that night, the city seemed a little less cold. The weight on his chest had lightened, if only for a moment. And for the first time in a long time, Grant realized that maybe he didn't have to figure everything out on his own. Maybe, just maybe, he could start to let go of the past and allow himself to move forward. Grant hadn't expected it to hit him so soon, but the guilt arrived like a heavy fog, swallowing him whole. It had been weeks since he'd walked away from Veronica. Weeks since he made the choice to free himself from the web of lies she had spun around him, but the guilt was relentless, unyielding. At first, the relief had been all-consuming. He thought that once the decision was made, once he was free of the chaos he had been living in, he would find peace. But as the days dragged on, as he sat in the quiet of his apartment, alone with his thoughts, the weight of his choice began to crush him in a way he hadn't anticipated. The relief was still there, but now it felt tainted, laced with regret. He had made the right decision, hadn't he? He had walked away from someone who had betrayed him, who had deceived him in ways that were almost impossible to fathom. But in the silence that followed, he began to question himself. He questioned whether there was something he could have done differently. Was there a way he could have saved the relationship without sacrificing his self-respect? Or had he just been too quick to give up on the woman he had once believed was his future? The guilt gnawed at him late at night, when he was left alone with nothing but his memories. He would close his eyes and remember the good times, the laughter, the way Veronica had made him feel like the most important person in the world. He remembered her soft voice, the warmth of her touch, the promises they had whispered to each other in moments of vulnerability. It all felt so real, so undeniable, and yet now it seemed like a lie. And then there were the questions, the constant, unrelenting questions that circled in his mind. Had he been too quick to judge her? Had he thrown everything away too easily? Maybe he had been too focused on his own hurt to see the bigger picture. Maybe he should have tried harder to understand why Veronica had done what she did. Could their relationship have been saved? Or had it always been doomed, even before he had found out the truth? The guilt became more than just a passing thought. It became an anchor, tethering him to a past that he was trying so desperately to escape. The image of Veronica, tearful and apologetic, haunted him. How could he have been so certain that walking away was the right choice when part of him still loved her? He had promised her once, with all his heart, that he would stand by her, that he would support her no matter what. And yet, here he was, running away from the very commitment he had made. Grant buried his head in his hands, feeling the weight of his choices crush him. He had left Veronica, but in doing so, he had also left behind a version of himself that had believed in unconditional love, in loyalty, in a shared future. That part of him felt broken now. He had believed so fiercely, had trusted so fully, that the betrayal had shattered not just his relationship, but his faith in himself. In the quiet of his apartment, in the stillness that surrounded him, the guilt had room to grow. But then, as if to cut through the suffocating cloud that hung over him, a memory surfaced, of Amanda, her voice, her warmth. For the first time in weeks, a flicker of light broke through the fog. It wasn't love. He wasn't ready for that. But Amanda had offered him something he hadn't realized he needed. A moment of relief, of comfort, a reminder that not all connections were based on betrayal and lies. With her, there was no pressure, no expectations, just two people who saw each other for who they were in that moment. And yet, even as the memory of her smile offered him a small measure of solace, the guilt still remained. Was he using Amanda to escape the pain? Was he rushing into something new before he had even allowed himself to heal? He didn't know, but the guilt clung to him, a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. He had hurt Veronica, yes, but had he also hurt himself in the process? He leaned back against the couch, the weight of his thoughts threatening to drown him. There were no easy answers, no clear path forward. All he had now were his decisions, and the consequences of those choices, both the good and the bad. The truth was, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. The man who had trusted, the man who had been betrayed. Was that the same man who now sat here, lost in a sea of self-doubt? The phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Amanda, just a simple text checking in to see how he was doing. She hadn't been demanding, hadn't pushed for more than he was ready to give. And yet, just the fact that she cared felt like a lifeline in the midst of his storm. For the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel so alone. Grant sat up, looking at the screen, feeling a flicker of hope. Maybe it was too soon. Maybe he wasn't ready for any of it. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a small, tentative spark of something other than guilt. A spark that could lead to something more. Or maybe, at the very least, it was a spark that could help him find himself again. The decision had been looming over Grant for days. It was like a storm that had been gathering in the distance, darkening the horizon, and now it was right above him, ready to break. Every time he thought about it, his stomach twisted in knots. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, Veronica's face, tear-streaked and pleading. But there was something else in his mind now, something just as clear, the face of Amanda, warm and understanding, someone who had shown him what it was like to be seen, to be accepted for who he was, flaws and all. The past few weeks had been a blur of pain and confusion, the remnants of his broken relationship with Veronica mixing with the new, unfamiliar feeling that had begun to grow inside him. Hope. He had never expected it, but Amanda had given him a glimpse of a life beyond the pain. But now, with everything hanging in the balance, it felt like there was no way forward without making a choice. A real choice. It was the weekend, and Grant sat in his apartment, staring out the window at the city he had come to love and despise all at once. The sunlight streamed in, but it did little to ease the tightness in his chest. His mind kept drifting back to Veronica, the lies, the hurt, the betrayal. But there were also the memories, the moments of happiness, the small touches, the way she had made him feel like he was worth something. And then, there was Amanda. It wasn't love, not yet, but she had become something more than just a distraction. She had offered him comfort, understanding, a sense of peace he hadn't realized he needed. The pull between the two women was undeniable, but it wasn't just about them. It was about him. Grant had spent so much of his life running from difficult decisions, hoping they would just fade away or fix themselves. But now, as he sat there, the decision was clear. He couldn't keep holding on to a version of the past that no longer existed. He couldn't keep clinging to a love that had been broken, not when he knew deep down that it was time to move on. The sound of his phone breaking the silence snapped him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen, another message from Veronica. He hadn't responded to her in days, and part of him wanted to throw the phone across the room. He wasn't sure if he could bear another conversation with her, not when everything inside him was screaming that it was over. But as his fingers hovered over the phone, he felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. The relief was clear. He was finally ready to let go. But the sadness? That was the part that hurt the most. It wasn't just about the end of a relationship. It was the end of a dream he had believed in so fiercely, and for a moment it almost felt like he was losing himself too. With a deep breath, he opened the message. Veronica's words were simple, filled with regret and pleading, but they didn't make him second-guess his decision. They only reinforced it. She was sorry. She had always been sorry. But sorry wasn't enough anymore. Sorry didn't erase the hurt she had caused. Sorry didn't heal the wounds. He began typing, his fingers moving with purpose. He had no time for more explanations, no time for more back and forth. The decision had been made. I can't do this anymore, Veronica. I need to move on. You need to move on. I'm sorry, but it's over. He hit send and the message was gone, just like that. And in that moment, Grant felt the weight lift. He wasn't free of the pain, not yet. But he was free from the constant uncertainty, the back and forth that had been holding him captive. He had made the choice. He had chosen himself. The next step, the one he had been avoiding, loomed ahead. Amanda. He had no idea where it would go, no idea what they could be. But something told him that with her, there was a chance. A chance to heal. A chance to start fresh. It wouldn't be easy. It would take time, maybe more than he had left in him, but it was a chance he wasn't willing to throw away. Grant stood up and walked over to his coat. As he slid it on, his phone buzzed again. A message from Amanda this time. He smiled softly, reading the simple words, "How are you doing today?" It wasn't much, it wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough. Enough to remind him that there was someone out there who was willing to meet him halfway, who wasn't trying to fix him, but was simply offering a place to heal. Grant tapped out a reply. "Better, I think. Thanks for asking." As he hit send, he felt a sense of peace settle in, a feeling of quiet certainty. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to walk it. Grant stood by the window, staring out at the city skyline. It was early morning, and the first light of dawn spilled across the streets, casting everything in a soft glow. For a moment, everything felt still, as if time itself had paused to give him a chance to catch his breath. The last few months had been a whirlwind, filled with heartache, regret, and decisions that seemed impossible to make. Yet, as he looked out at the new day unfolding before him, he felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in what felt like forever, he could breathe without the weight of the past pressing down on him. He had made the choice to walk away from the life he had built with Veronica, and although the pain still lingered in the corners of his mind, he knew he had done what was best for him. No more lies, no more pretending. It was time to move forward. Grant had always believed that healing would come quickly, that the moment he made a decision, everything would fall into place. But the truth was, healing took time, and he wasn't in a rush anymore. He had learned that the hard way. He thought about Amanda, the woman who had quietly entered his life and offered him something he hadn't realized he needed, a gentle reminder that not all connections were born from pain. She hadn't tried to fix him, hadn't pushed him into anything he wasn't ready for. She had simply been there, offering him her presence, her understanding. And somewhere in the midst of the confusion and the mess of his emotions, he had found something new, hope. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something different, something honest, something real. Grant hadn't known what to expect from meeting Amanda. He had walked into that bar expecting to drink away his sorrows, hoping to forget the hurt. But instead, she had given him something much more valuable, a space to simply exist without the weight of expectations or the pressure of unresolved emotions. With her, he didn't have to be anyone other than himself, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like himself. He picked up his phone and looked at the text from Amanda. Just a simple message. "How's your day going?" It wasn't much, but it meant everything. In a world where everything had felt out of control, Amanda's words reminded him that not all relationships had to be complicated. Not all connections had to be tied to past wounds. Sometimes all you needed was someone who made you feel seen, who understood the unspoken parts of you that you weren't even ready to share. Grant replied quickly, "It's going better, one step at a time." He put the phone down, feeling a warmth spread through him. The uncertainty that had once clouded his mind had lifted, replaced by a quiet confidence. He had made his decision. He had chosen himself. And now, as he stood on the brink of this new beginning, he knew that the future was uncertain, but it was his to shape. There was still work to be done. He still had to face the aftermath of his past, the mistakes he had made, the ways he had hurt Veronica. But for the first time in months, Grant felt like he was ready to face it. Not because he had all the answers, but because he had learned to embrace the process. He stepped outside, feeling the cool morning air on his face. The city was waking up, bustling with life, full of possibilities. And for the first time in a long time, Grant felt like he was part of it again. As he walked down the street, the weight of his past growing distant with each step, he felt a quiet but firm sense of resolve. This was the beginning of something new, not just with Amanda, but with himself. He wasn't the same man he had been when he first walked away from Veronica. He had learned, grown, and healed in ways he hadn't imagined possible. And as he looked up at the rising sun, Grant realized that he didn't need to have it all figured out. He didn't need to know what the future held. He just needed to keep moving forward, one step at a time, and that, for now, was enough. What do you think of Grant's journey through heartbreak and self-discovery? From which region are you watching this video? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. And make sure to check out more heartwarming tales by clicking here on the end screen.